In this module, we are going to discuss on research approach and how to select a research approach. We start with first trying to define the four key terms or which will help us to zero in down on the research approach. First term is the philosophical assumptions which work around the research which a researcher is going to conduct. The second one is the research approach or methodology. The third one is research design. And the fourth one talks about research methods. Let us try to discuss each of these methods in detail. First, let us discuss philosophical assumptions. The philosophical assumptions are the viewpoints or a set of beliefs which informs the study. It could be the beliefs and values that the researcher considers as most important for the study. There are four classical philosophical assumptions. The first one is positivism, or in a post-positivism, the researcher believes that the reality is objective. It can be perceived as objective. The data can be perceived as objective by the researcher. Here, the concept of numbers, empirical observations, and mostly post-positivism philosophical assumptions is used in a quantitative study. And the difference between positivism and post-positivism was, in a positivism, reality was considered absolutely objective, whereas in a post-positivism, reality was considered to be objective, and also it was considered that the biases and the perception of the researcher influences a bit on the reality. So this term post-positivism is now more common in the philosophical assumptions. So you would say a researcher would take a post-positivist stance for theory verification. So the first philosophical assumption would be post-positivism. The second one is constructivism. Here, this assumption came across that knowledge is created by virtue of interactions among the individuals. So, knowledge is not totally objective, but rather it is created with interactions. When there is a concept of understanding getting generated due to interactions among individuals. Take, for instance, if we are looking at a concept like emotional intelligence, it can be perceived as how an individual interact with fellow human beings in order to make sense of this aspect of emotional intelligence. And this knowledge in constructivism assumption is perceived that knowledge is basically created from social and historical constructions. So this type of studies are more qualitative in nature. And such studies are mostly used for theory generation. The third type of philosophical assumption is transformative. In transformative, the assumption is knowledge can be used to empower or suppress the individuals. So knowledge, when it has the power to oppress or empower individuals, it can lead to power. It can be justice oriented and political, and that led to researchers taking various stances like a Marxist stance or a feminist perspective, or you take it from a social perspective. So this led to research being considered not only from a constructivist point of view, but also from trying to look with an assumption that whether it either empowers or it suppresses a particular class in the research which we are being conducted. Here, these are basically change-oriented assumptions, and also it uses both qualitative and quantitative studies. The last one is pragmatism. As the name suggests, pragmatists are bothered more about solving problems in a practical manner. It is basically on the consequences of action. And it is like the fundamental assumption is knowledge can be used to solve real world problems which are practice oriented. So this philosophy came across pragmatism, wherein mixed methods like qualitative and quantitative studies are widely used in a pragmatist perspective. So as a researcher, first thing when you have a research problem, first thing we need to ask ourselves, is this research problem post-positivist oriented, constructivist oriented? If it is positivist oriented, then I will use a quantitative study. If it is constructivist oriented, then or interpretivist oriented, then I would be using a qualitative study. And if it is the problem is transformative oriented, you are looking at something like class struggles, you are looking at some gender studies, then is this a transformative oriented? Then you can use either qualitative or quantitative study depending upon the depending upon the topic you are being studying. Pragmatism. The third aspect, in the fourth aspect, talk about pragmatism. Are you concerned with solving the real world practice problems? Then you take an approach called pragmatism. This brings an end to this module.